has a way of instilling fear into our lives. Darkness, the absence of light. As kids, we go through this phase where we are scared to death of the dark. It petrifies us. We are scared to go to bed at night thinking that there is some horribly disfigured, slobbering, nasty thing under the dark abyss that is underneath our bed, or in the recesses of our closet, that something is waiting there to get you. Now, most of us have grown out of this. Most of us have grown out of this phase, but I hesitate to say that we have overcome our fear of darkness. I think there is a certain fear that we all have of darkness. I've felt it. My wife and I, we were at a place outside of San Antonio, Texas called Natural Bridge Caverns. And as the name suggests, there's a lot of underground caves. There's a lot of underground caverns down there. One tour that we were on, we were with about 20 or so people. The tour guide led us to this dead-end cavern. So we're down there, we get to the end, and he has us all sit down. And I don't know how far underground we were. But then he said, "Stay seated, don't move." He shuts off all the lights. And it was dark. And there was not an ounce or a drop, if you will, of light in that. And the longer I sat in the darkness, the more alone I felt. Now when you think about it, I knew my wife was sitting right to my left. I could probably feel her hand or her face. She was sitting right to my left. I knew there were 20 or so people around us. But I didn't have to be by myself to feel alone. I think that's part of the power that darkness still has over us. That it's able to instill this fear into us by flooding us with sense of insecurity as we get this feeling of loneliness, that we feel like we are alone. I have to tell you, the days are not getting brighter and brighter. The days are getting darker and darker. They have been ever since Jesus left this world. There are times when you feel those lights dimming in your life. The weight of the cross that you are bearing, the suffering for Jesus' sake, grows a little bit heavier, more and more, every day. And there may be times when you feel like the lights are just about to go out. If that's the case, I want you to really listen to Jesus' words this morning. And know that Jesus is there when the lights go out. Because if you're feeling a sense of loneliness as you carry that burden of your own cross, I want you to know Jesus knows how you feel because he carried a very big sense of loneliness. Only on a much, much bigger scale than we could possibly imagine. 8 days before Luke begins our account this morning, 8 days, Jesus was with his disciples. He asked them a simple question. He said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter, outspoken Peter, he gets up and he says, "Jesus, you're not John the Baptist. You're not just some prophet. Jesus, you are the Christ. You are the one that Israel has been waiting for so long." But he didn't understand the implications of what that meant. And as Jesus began to explain to his disciples that it meant that he'd have to suffer, that it meant that he would have to die, that it meant that he had to carry a very literal cross, Peter rebuked Jesus. "No way." You remember what Jesus said to Peter after that? "Get behind me. Get behind me, Satan." You see, even Jesus' closest friends, those 12 disciples, even they didn't understand what it was that he had to go and do. The days were getting darker and darker for Jesus, as he was very much alone on his mission. So that's why I find it very awesome that in this account, we see Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah, two of God's chosen prophets throughout history, two of the greatest prophets, I guess you could say, throughout history, are talking face to face with Jesus. And when you look at what they're talking about, it makes sense that they would be talking about the one thing that nobody else understood except Jesus, his mission. His having to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die for the sins of the whole world. It makes sense that they would be talking about that. And while we don't know exactly how the conversation went, we don't have the dialogue in front of us, I think it's safe to say that Moses and Elijah were very qualified to talk to Jesus about the loneliness that he felt about his mission, because Moses and Elijah knew very well the loneliness of carrying their crosses in their own ministries. They were able to encourage Jesus. Take Moses, for example. Take Moses. Look at Moses. It didn't take him long in his ministry to find out just how lonely his ministry was going to be. You recall the Exodus, all the Israelites in Egypt, Pharaoh led my people go. You've got this mass exodus of millions of Israelites coming out of Egypt. And where's their first stop? Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, not the second time that we just read in our first lesson, the first time to Mount Sinai. And when they got there, God said, Moses, only my chosen prophet is allowed to come up to me in my presence. And he goes up with God, and he receives the 2 tablets of testimony. Those 2 tablets where God was making his covenant with the people. And as Moses descends that mountain, as he goes down, do you remember what he was greeted by? Singing and dancing all around a golden calf that they were worshiping as their God. Their new idol. And that insult to injury, Aaron, his second in command, his closest buddy, was the one who made that golden calf. And Moses found himself completely alone. And in his anger and his rage, he took those 2 tablets and he smashed them on the ground. He was alone, and this was just the beginning of how lonely his ministry would be, as he would then have to deal with the constant nagging and groaning and grumbling of the Israelites for 40 years in the desert, complaining against him, complaining against God. Moses knew what it was like to be alone. Elijah knew what it was like to be alone. Elijah, God's chosen prophet at a time when wicked King Ahab ruled over Israel. At a time when Baal worship, fertility god, where Baal worship was running amok in Israel. It was a time when the word of God was maybe a distant memory, maybe just a faint whisper. And Elijah found himself on Mount Carmel, facing 450 prophets of Baal to one prophet of God. He knew what it was like to be alone. But that showdown to find out whose God was real, you'd figure after Elijah won the battle that he would feel not so alone anymore. It got even worse. As he fled for his life after winning that showdown, if you will, because now a bounty was out on his head. And after he fled for a while, he came to the realization, I just want to die. Because I'm the only one left. I feel like there's no one else here. Elijah knew what it was like to be alone. Moses and Elijah knew what it was like to carry crosses, burdens, when God's word was not very popular. And here Moses and Elijah are talking with Jesus on this Mount of Transfiguration. Talking with Jesus in this glorious light that Jesus has. And if that wasn't enough, if that wasn't enough to take in, enter stage left, God the Father, coming in his own glory in this cloud that envelops all those people on there, and this booming voice comes from the cloud, reaffirming everything that God said at Jesus' baptism, this is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. And then Luke says, and when the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. It was almost as if someone flipped a switch. Just like that. God the Father, Moses, Elijah, gone. Jesus was alone. He was alone. Sure, he descended that hill with his disciples. He was very much alone in his mission. And as he descended that hill, he set his face towards Jerusalem, bound and determined to go to Jerusalem, to finish what God started, finish his mission. And as the days were darker, the lights were dimming more and more, he felt the loneliness of his mission. It was a mission. It was the world. Billions and billions and billions of people to one. But he had to do it. And 6 months from this transfiguration, Jesus would find himself on a different hill. He would find himself on the hill of Golgotha, alone, abandoned by all his disciples, by all his friends, nailed to that cross that he was carrying around. He was alone so that you wouldn't have to be alone. When the lights went out on that hill of Golgotha, Jesus was there so that you wouldn't have to. Though it may not seem like it at first, when you look at that hill of Golgotha, that we'll look at in about a month on Good Friday, Jesus' glory was there. Jesus' glory was there. It was there in the perfect sacrifice, in the forgiveness of sins, in the atonement, the reconciliation, the restored relationship that you now have with God. His glory was there. And in fact, it's the same glory that we see on this mountain of transfiguration. This glory that was revealed, and this whole experience with Moses and Elijah and Jesus and his glory was not just for Jesus' sake. It was for your sake. So that you could see a glimpse of the divine glory of God. And what a sight that was. Jesus was transfigured. So I've said that about 5 times already. What in the world does transfigured mean? What does that word mean? It means that, if you will, picture that his human nature was kind of peeled back. And his divine nature was showing forth in all its unhindered, unobstructed glory. And Luke and the other gospel writers, for that matter, they have a hard time just describing what this glory was like. Luke tells us, what's the brightest thing I can think of? A flash of lightning. It was like a flash of lightning, a flash that lights up the entire night sky. Only one continuous flash that is there. It was like the glory that we saw in our first reading of Moses' face as it reflected the glory of God the Father. Way too much for the people to look at. Moses has something over your face. We can't stand it. Could you imagine being Peter, James, and John? You're groggy on the mountain, and then you're waking up, and you know how your eyes need that time to adjust, and boom, the first thing you see is the glory of God? That's a lot to take in. And it's this glory of God that is just so amazing. It's this glory of God that John tells us in Revelation. That's why we're not going to need any sort of sun or any sort of light source when we're in heaven. John says this in Revelation chapter 21. He says the city, when we're in heaven, the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The writer of the Hebrews says in chapter 1, verse 3, he says the sun is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being. The whole point of this glory is that you can't take this account for granted. Peter, James, and John got to see a glimpse of the full glory of God, and by his grace they lived to tell you about it. Think of memories that stick in your mind. Think of your most vivid memories. Okay, maybe your most vivid memories, one of them might be your wedding day, or the birth of a child, or that first buck that you ever shot, or maybe it's the greatest vacation that you've been on. I will bet that for Peter, James, and John, this was one of their most vivid memories. That they got to see the glory of God, that they got a foretaste of heaven itself. They get to tell you, Jesus revealed his glory to those three men, to us today, but to those three men, to show them who he was, that there would be no doubt who Jesus was. So that they wouldn't forget who he was, not on that mountain, not later on the cross that he would be in. And that was important because they found themselves in some very lonely moments in their ministries. Peter and James, history tells us, were martyred, to put it nicely. Were martyred for their faith, for their faithful service. And what did John get for his faithful service? He got his own whole island. He was exiled to Patmos to live out the days and to die by himself. Those three men knew the crosses that they bore, and when the lights seemed to go out on their lives and when nobody else seemed to be there, Jesus was there, making sure that they were not. And that's comforting. It's comforting to know that as heavy as your crosses get, the burdens that you carry for Christ, and as dim as the lights seem to be getting in your life, Jesus is there so that you are not going to be alone. And when you look at this transfiguration story, you can't help but realize this is the reason why you're doing all this. And this is the reason why you're here. This is the reason why you'll continue on in the faith. This is the reason why you don't give up. Why you don't just quit. Because you see who Jesus really is. How could you quit? How could you give up? After seeing a story like this, after seeing the radiance of God's glory there on that mountain, put your trust in him. And know that no matter how heavy that burden gets on your shoulders and that cross gets, Jesus is going to be there to make sure you're not alone. He knows the pain you're going through. He's able to help you with it. That's an awesome God that we have. It's an awesome God that we have, one who shared in our human nature, who gave us a glimpse of still the divine nature that he had. And even with that divine nature, he gave it all up to take your place. To die for your sins. One, we have an awesome God who shows us that even with all that glory, he is going to be there for you to make sure that you're not alone. By your side always, so that even when the lights seem to be dimming, he is there. And when your time of grace is over, when the lights have gone out, Jesus is